Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. After a disastrous Hungarian Grand Prix, Ferrari are set to take to the track again in Budapest as they try and figure out what went wrong this past weekend and whether they can give Leclerc and Hamilton anything to smile about over the summer break, or will they find that their car is completely screwed and there is really no potential in the SO25 that they've been promising us all season. What's going to happen tomorrow when they have another test to try and resolve these issues? Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I'd greatly appreciate it. Couple of quick stories around the F1 world to start with. This is one of them. Enrico Cardile, former Ferrari man as we know, joining Aston Martin. He's basically going to be under Adrian Newey in that technical operation. Now, he was blamed by many for the Ferrari, let's say, shortcomings over the last couple of years. But, maybe in hindsight, it's a bit of a different story. Now, there was a bit of drama because he was on gardening leave before joining Aston Martin, but there were rumours that he was effectively getting around it, as some people tried to. Then there was an Italian court that upheld Ferrari's perspective, but now it's locked in and he's officially starting an Aston Martin as of the last couple of days. Few comments on McLaren. F1 Big Data put this together. Ground effect race winners since the start of 2022. Bahrain 2022, what a different time that felt like, going from Bahrain to Jeddah to Melbourne. Then they had the stint in the middle of the year, and, there's a lot of blue here when Verstappen was winning everything. And then, there was a period at the end of 2024 where you didn't know who was going to win. And this year, it is increasingly papaya towards the right-hand side of this graphic. And speaking of McLaren, it's very clear we have a two-horse fight in the Drivers' Championship. They've literally 1-2'd the last 4 Grand Prix in a row. What's going to happen next? And as far as I'm concerned, are we going to see more of what we saw in Austria happen again? Piastri wasn't so annoyed in the post-race interviews as maybe I thought that he might be, because I think he recognises, okay, you know what, fair play, Lando, you got pushed into that position of trying the one-stop. It wasn't like McLaren were giving Norris the favoured strategy for the driver that's secretly their favourite, or whatever you want to say. They're, of course, trying to keep things fair, but what was very interesting is that the two drivers did nearly come to blows, as this image was actually during practice, right? When it was Norris down the inside of Piastri, and then during the race, it was very nearly the other way around. Now, Stella says that they are open to continuing this whole split strategies. And I think that it's good for us fans that at least they recognise McLaren. They have the constructors well and truly in the bag. So if their drivers were to crash each other out of the race, as bad as that would be, it's not really the end of the world. They're one of the constructors anyway. Of course, they're not going to want that to happen, but they're okay with letting their drivers fight. They're okay with letting their drivers say, hey, I want to try the one-stop, I want to try the two-stop. And I think what Piastri will probably recognise, especially after this Grand Prix, is that what Lando did in Hungary around certain tracks that are difficult to overtake on, Piastri may well do a similar thing. If you are behind your teammates, why not go for the one-stop? Because, okay, let's say it's a marginal one-stop, two-stop, and we'll see some of the tyres in a second on other circuits to see whether that may be the case. But let's say I'm Piastri and Lando's ahead of me, then they're not going to pit me first and let me undercut my teammates if they've not learned anything from Budapest last year. So presumably they'll do what they did in Budapest this year, which is to say, okay, the lead driver, he gets preference on strategy. We know, for example, Baku, we'll get into that in a second, which could be a two-stop this year for an interesting reason that we shall discuss. That was not a good time for, obviously, Norris last time out. It was a great time out for Piastri, as we know. Now, if Oscar is second or Norris is second or whatever the case is, they're going to pit the lead driver first. And if there's a two-stop versus a one-stop debate, if I'm the second driver, I'm already preparing to go for the one-stop, because if I go for the one-stop, I know that I'm going to end up ahead of my teammate at some point, and he's going to have to pass me on the track. And I'm going to make that difficult to do. And of course, papaya rules, right? Yeah, Piastri pushed the limits. I mean, they weren't happy with this, right? Like, his engineer was on the radio even before Piastri did this and told him, look, you know how we race, then this happens. He locks up. He nearly takes Lando out and takes off his own front wing. Very close, very marginal. And then as soon as that happened, his engineer was on the radio saying, hey, Oscar, basically same as last lap, same rules apply. are kind of implying that we weren't particularly happy with that, like what they told him back in Austria. Would have been absolute fireworks had they taken each other out of the race. But the point is that Piastri, yeah, he tried something here. Like, this was a big dive bomb. It was a very optimistic one at that. But he knows, and Lando knows, that, the team is the team, and you're not meant to take your teammate out of the race. Now, of course, here's a Lando fan suggesting that if push comes to shove, Piastri would be willing to do that. And do I agree with that assessment? Yeah, maybe I do. Yeah, let's say there's a title decider. You go to Abu Dhabi. Let's say it's a Prost-Senna type situation, right? Who's more likely to make that decision? Now, of course, Schumacher got disqualified for similar antics back in the day from the whole championship. So you can't just take your teammate out deliberately because he's going to beat you in the championship. Doesn't really work like that. But, you can be, let's say you can take a bit more risk if the championship is in your favour. I think what I'm saying here is that the one-stop strategy for either of the McLarens, if they're just going to keep 1-2ing every weekend, becomes very compelling. If I'm the driver in seconds, I'm probably starting the race thinking, maybe I'll go for the one-stop here, right? Especially after what happened in Budapest, thinking maybe I'll preserve the tyres in the first stint, and then when my teammate pits, I'll push hard, go for the one-stop, and then save tyres to hold him off at the ends. It's a viable strategy, certainly in these regulations, and I think we might see more of it. So let's say the McLarens just 1-2 lock out everything from the rest of the season. I can imagine the driver in seconds will be seriously thinking about whether a one-stop could be a good idea, because yeah, your teammate's probably not going to dive bomb you into turn one and take you both out of the race, as we saw with Piastri, right? The two-stop was probably the faster strategy in Budapest. That's what Pirelli said after the race, that they think the two-stop was quicker. And maybe with a few more laps, Piastri would have got him. But Lando did very well managing the tyres, but also Piastri couldn't take that much risk because it's his own teammate there in front and the implications that has. So something to keep an eye on, and there are some Grand Prix, as I say, that are going a step softer. We may see some two-stops. So these are the tyre compounds for the rest of the season. Probably 3 or 4 things to note here. I think they've gone a step harder, have they, in Interlagos, which I'm not sure is the right decision, but maybe it's going to rain anyway. Things that are worthy of note. Azerbaijan, they've gone a step softer. The C6 is going to come to play in Baku. We know that tyre is probably not going to last the whole lap, to be honest. But typically, Baku, they run soft compounds, but it's typically a one-stop. But maybe that's going to make it a two-stop. The hard tyre is going to be the C4. In Qatar, the soft tyre is the C3. So that goes to show something. The US and Mexico City, they are once again going to do the offset. So the hard tyre is going to be an additional step harder than the medium. So this is an interesting idea. Usually in Mexico, they run some of the softer compounds. This time the hard is actually going to be the C2, which is probably just going to be slow, but will enable you to do the one-stop. So I think the idea of this, I think, is to give a bit more discrepancy, because sometimes the hard tyre, if it's just one step softer than the medium, is very easily capable of doing a one-stop. But if you want to one-stop, you've got to use now a harder compound even than that, which, yeah, you can one-stop with it, but it's just going to be quite slow. Like in the US, they're going to be using the C1. I can't imagine that's going to be very fast around Austin compared to the C3 or the C4. But if you want a one-stop, that's probably what you've got to use. But the two-stop opportunities are going to be there with either the C1, C3, C3 or C3, C3, C4. Something like that is an absolute possibility. I think it's good that Pirelli are trying this. Hopefully it creates some more interesting races. And look, if we are just going to get two McLarens fighting it out of the front for the rest of the season, at least it's quite likely that we get some strategy offsets that keep things interesting, as it was in Budapest. Couple of things on Mercedes and Red Bull. Max, of course, is staying at Red Bull, and Toto says, we'll come out and say what kind of term we have put forward, but definitely George is staying. Now, what's very interesting about this George situation is that it's not over yet when it comes to these contract discussions. Yeah, George is going to be driving a Mercedes next year, but under what conditions? condition, under what contract, under what salary, and also how long is that offer going to be? Yeah, Max has committed his future to Red Bull for 2026, but not necessarily for 2027. And if you are Toto Wolff, you want to make it clear to Max that the door is potentially still ajar if you did want to come to Mercedes, if they nailed it in 2026, and also make it clear to George that you are not, necessarily safe, so you better keep banging in the good performances. That's at least one potential logic you might have. And Russell therefore says these negotiations are not simple. Russell would love a 2-year guaranteed deal bare minimum, probably more than that. But Toto is probably not so convinced. Now, on the other piece of the puzzle at Mercedes, their car is now done for the season. There's no more upgrades, all resources now for next year. The team will try and get the most out of the car, and the same applies for Ferrari and other teams as well. This is interesting, though, that Toto said on that rear suspension, they brought the rear suspension in Imola. It didn't work. Then it worked in Canada because of the very specific circuit requirements. And then they realised it was actually terrible. And Toto says that rear axle is going to end up in a bin somewhere. That was an instability that basically took all confidence from the drivers, and it took us a few races to figure it out. And now they are back on the podium, right? Thanks to Ferrari, as we'll get to in a second. But Ferrari and Mercedes, both of those teams, and Red Bull, to be fair, right? Red Bull have brought tons of upgrades this year. Like, that Red Bull is so different. Okay, it looks the same, obviously. But if you look at that Red Bull, aerodynamically, every component, pretty much, they've tweaked almost everything on that Red Bull. And it's not solved the core issues at all. McLaren seem to be the only team that actually is capable of bringing an upgrade that actually works. They've brought quite a few changes to their car this year, and basically everything has worked, which is pretty scary for the next generation of regulations, maybe. But like, every period of dominance, as we know, comes to an end, and it certainly did for Mercedes, and now they're still struggling to find their footing, right? The idea that in the final year of the regs, they still brought a change that just completely failed and is going to end up in the bin is pretty bad, but maybe not quite as bad as to what's going on at Red Bull, or potentially quite as bad as what's going on at Ferrari. I think Verstappen, I mean, obviously he now knows, he's known for some time that winning the championship this year was not on the cards. He's actually on his 3rd worst run ever, which is kind of interesting. So he has gone 4 races now without a podium, which is pretty rare for Max. He did 6 in a row from 2017 to 2018, and he did 12 in a row, of course, basically in that same period. But since then, pretty much, he's always been on the podium relatively regularly, and now having 4 in a row with no podium is very rare for Max indeed. Now, for next year, of course, the team is still going to be bigging it up and saying that things are going to be great. And Marco says that obviously it's a big release, don't know, whatever, for Red Bull that Max is going to be staying, and says the team is really enthusiastic about building him a better car. And it's like, look, if you had the ability to build him a better car in this regulation cycle, you probably would have done so already, and that's clearly not been the case this year. And the real casualty of it probably right now is none other than Yuki Tsunoda, and also Christian Horner's job, and maybe both of those guys will return at some point to a different team in the future. Let's talk Ferrari though. What went on there? What needs to change? Charles Leclerc says that Hamilton's weekend was likely an outlier, but it was terrible from start to finish, really. Hamilton, it wasn't like the pace was horrific in the practice, but of course, after qualifying poorly, could make no progress in the race. And it's not like Charles Leclerc was any happier than Hamilton after going from pole to 4th, based on issues that were not his own doing. Now, we'll talk about some of the reasons for that in a second. Of course, we discussed Hamilton yesterday, some of the implications, some of the comments he made to the press after the weekend, which were nonetheless particularly fascinating. But what went wrong with the Ferrari? What do they need to change? What maybe can they learn and try and resolve? So De Kessa and the guys at Formula Uno, they put their article out there. They talk about the issues. So do Corriere, so do Motorsport Italy, and they all come up with effectively the same solution, and that is the answer that George Russell gave shortly after the race, that indeed the best explanation that we have is that they reduced power output on the straight to try and limit the plank wear on Leclerc's car, and they had to raise the tyre pressure substantially in the final stint to achieve the same thing. Motorsport Italia say it, that they raised the tyre pressures, they reduced the engine power to prevent the plank wear, and the core issues of the car resurfaced. And this is a real concern for Ferrari. They brought this new rear suspension. They looked at the telemetry data when they did that test back in Mugello, and they said that, okay, the car doesn't feel that different to the drivers, but it is better at managing this plank wear, and therefore, presumably, we can run the car at a lower ride height, generate more performance, and that was performance that allowed Leclerc to get pole position in the right conditions, and allowed Leclerc to be straight up the fastest man on track in the first stint of the race. Now, I think there is a debate to be had on whether this whole plank wear thing should even be a discussion. The plank is 10 millimeters thick, and if it wears by more than a millimeter, then you get disqualified. I mean, think about that, right? A millimeter of wear, that's all that's allowed. If it's slightly less than that, if it's 0.8 of a millimeter, your car's fine. If it's 1.1 of a millimeter, you get disqualified. Now, that is genuinely the margin right now that is preventing Ferrari from being competitive. And of course, if the rules were different, other teams would also push the limit more and gain more performance, right? So the rule exists for a reason in terms of where the car has to be ridden. And, you know, they've come up with these rules. It is what it is. But these rules are basically a side effect of the ground effect era. When we go to next year, is it going to be as relevant in terms of ride height? You know, there's talk next year about teams running rake again on the car, like Red Bull used to, of course, famously do in the previous iteration, where plank wear is not going to be even a talking point. But this year, it's a big talking point. And you can debate whether this really should be a factor. You know, I'm sure plenty of Ferrari fans would say this is kind of ridiculous, right? We're talking about 0.1 of a millimeter on a plank wear. Like, you know, maybe that rule shouldn't even exist. Just maximize the performance wherever you can. And if that was true, then probably McLaren would find a way to lower the car even more and gain even more performance, right? They want to stay in the right window. And it seems that Ferrari are just incapable of doing so. The frustrating thing for them is that they thought this new rear suspension was going to fix it. They thought they were going to turn up to Spa, and then most certainly here in Hungary, where the downforce is greater, the plank wear is going to be greater because the car's sitting closer to the roads, and they thought the rear suspension was going to deliver, but it became clear during the race that they'd maybe over-egged it, right? They'd given Leclerc a ride height, which was giving him loads of great performance during the race, but it had consequences. And potentially the same thing, we don't really know what happened with Hamilton just because he was stuck in such a train that we didn't really get a clear picture of what his pace would have been like. But presumably this issue, certainly the consequences of this issue, could well have slowed them down as well. Corriere say the same thing. Plank wear again reared its head as a problem with the Ferrari. They had to take evasive action, and they recognise now that the rear suspension has improved the car, but it has not resolved the issue that they can't run the car where they want to run it. Does it make what they're doing illegal? No, they're just pushing the limit. But and they recognise that this is the fastest way for them to run a race, is to run the car lower, to manage the plank wear, and then try and get to the ends and not get disqualified. That's the fastest way for them to run it than run the car higher, take less downforce, and then be able to max out, because simply it doesn't give them the performance. So the big news really is that today and tomorrow the teams are going to be on the track doing some more testing in Budapest. So there are a couple of teams today and a couple of teams tomorrow doing this. So this is the article here from D'Alessandro at Formula Uno, and basically his last paragraph suggests, I think it's just a direct quote from Mario Isola actually, from Pirelli, but he says the menu includes the validation of the construction. So they've got new tyres. 2026 they've got new tyres. But today and tomorrow they will be testing in Budapest for these new tyres. And the development of softer compounds, the homologation of which must be completed by the 1st September, particularly the C3, the C5. So Pirelli, obviously, it's a tyre test for them for 2026. They're probably going to be running very low downforce on the car to try and imitate the 2026 cars, which are going to be weaker in terms of overall downforce. That's what we've seen in other Pirelli tests. But it does give the teams a bit more running. So today was McLaren with Norris and Racing Bulls with Lawson. And then tomorrow is Ferrari with Leclerc, and then Alpine both days, one with Aron and then Colapinto and Gasly alternating. So yeah, Ferrari are going to be back on track with Leclerc tomorrow with the SF25, testing out the new Pirelli tyres. And maybe this is going to give them the running that they need, because I'm sure that in hindsight hindsight, they would have done things very differently, Ferrari, going into the weekend, and maybe they get an opportunity to play around with some ideas, especially when it comes to, well, said about the car. I imagine Pirelli mandates the teams what tyre pressures they run, what tyres they use, the compounds they use, how much they should be pushing this type of stuff. Of course, the test is meant to be for Pirelli rather than for the teams, but it might end up being kind of critical that Ferrari can turn up basically 2 days later at the same track at the same time of the year with the same car, and at least they can get some sort of running in to maybe help them figure out where they go from here going into the rest of the season, because it's very clear that Ferrari have a major issue, and it's a major issue that they will frankly just need to manage. It's clearly not one that can be resolved on the SF25, it's one that needs management, but if they get it right, I mean, look, Leclerc, had he finished the race without the intervention from Ferrari, would likely have been disqualified with probably a plank wear of an extra 0.1 of a millimetre or 0.2 of a millimetre or whatever it would have been. So the point is that Ferrari are very close to having a fast car that is legal. They're just not able to do it all the time. So that's the big challenge for them. The big thing, of course, for Ferrari, as we know, is turning up to Monza with a competitive car. That is the goal now, right? That is the goal for Ferrari. It's not to win the championship. It's not even really to win races. It's just to win Monza. That is the goal. We'll see if they can do it. And what happens tomorrow might be critical at getting them there. So very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.